Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Marybeth Gasman as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Marybeth Gasman is a Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair in Education, a distinguished professor and the Associate Dean for Research in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. She also served as the Executive Director of the Samuel David Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity and Justice and Executive Director of the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. Before joining Rutgers, she was the Judy and Howard Bukorwicz Endowment Professor in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Marybeth is a prolific scholar and prominent public voice on equity, leadership, and higher education, having authored or edited 36 books, written more than 300 peer-reviewed articles, essays, and book chapters, and published over 850 opinion pieces in leading newspapers and magazines. Education Week has ranked her among the nation's 20 most influential education scholars. Dr. Marybeth has secured more than $26 million in grant funding to advance her research and support the work of students, mentees, and minority serving institution partners. Her service includes trustee roles with the College Board and the historically black colleges and universities, including Paul Quinn College, Maurice Brown College, and St. Augustine College. She counts among her proudest achievements at the University of Pennsylvania's Provost Award for distinguished PhD teaching and mentoring, and her work as dissertation claim for more than 85 doctoral students since 2000. Outside of academia, Professor Marybeth is an avid photographer and dedicated writer who believes balance and harmony are essential to achieving meaningful life goals. In today's conversation, Dr. Marybeth Gasman discusses key ideas from her book, Doing the Right Thing: How Colleges and Universities Can Undo Systemic Racism in Faculty Hiring. The book is the winner of the Association of American Publishers Prose Award for Education Theory and Practice. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marybeth Gasman to the conversation. Dr. Marybeth, we
Thank,
are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you. Professor, in the book, you point out to a striking gap between growing student diversity and persistently low faculty diversity. What do you see as the most underestimated reason that this gap remains so entrenched?
Well, thank you for that question. And so when I was doing the research for this book, I was really struck by how diverse many of the campuses in the United States are, especially even the more elite campuses where you assume that they're not that diverse. But what I found is that the faculty was not diverse at all. And so I started to kind of look at that disconnect. And what happens is the majority of these highly elite institutions in the US, which is what I studied, they recruit PhD students, those PhD students, that group is not very diverse. And as a result, they usually only hire PhD students from that same group, and thus their faculty is not diverse. And what I was looking at are what are called AAU, or American Association of Universities institutions. And so if you can get your PhD at one of these institutions, there are, somewhere over 60 of them in North America, your chance of getting a faculty position at one of these elite institutions is much higher. The problem is the majority of people who are getting those PhDs at these AAU institutions are not Black and brown. They are white, and that keeps the faculty white. So the pipeline makes a really big difference. I will also say that where students are going makes a difference. So you see that a lot of Black and brown students are going to for-profit institutions. That makes it really hard to transfer to a major research institution, or they're going to institutions that have research but are not research heavy. So we would call them a research two institution in the United States. And so they're really at a disadvantage when it comes to getting jobs at major research institutions.
Professor, you rely on national data and interviews with provost, deans, and department leaders across 16 major universities. What patterns in those conversations best revealed how systemic racism show up in routine hiring decisions?
Another great question. So there are a variety of things. One of the things that I saw the most of was um, faculty on search committees will call their friends at other institutions rather than using a systematic process for bringing in candidates. So most people, there's lots of research that shows that most people are friends with people who are similar to them. So that means you get more and more people who are similar to the white people who are on the faculty. That's one thing. The next thing is that there's a lot of data available to make decisions about faculty hiring, but most of the people I talked to weren't using that data as part of their hiring process. And so that, what we do as faculty is we typically make data-driven decisions. In our research, right? We use research. We're very research-based. But in our practical decisions, we just avoid using research. And then what happens is like racism creeps in or gender discrimination creeps in. I would also say that a big one that I heard over and over was faculty saying, well, I care about diversity, but what about quality? And I think that's just a racist statement. So, for example, if you're talking about hiring a high quality faculty, why would you assume that people from diverse backgrounds are not highly qualified? That's a racist thought. So, I think like you have to check yourself. You have to say, why am I assuming this? And so there were so many things, but those are just a few that stood out for me.
Professor, many institutions publicly champion inclusive excellence, yet outcomes don't shift. What are the most common good intentions, weak execution moments you found in the faculty recruitment and selection?
So I talked to a lot of people who said they cared about a diverse faculty, but when I pushed them, many of them said, oh, well, that's really hard to do. Our faculty aren't going to go for that. That's a lot of work. They make a lot of excuses. For example, well, there aren't like black and brown people in the pipeline. And I'd say, well, did you look at the data? And they'd say, well, I don't know where the data is. I just heard that they're not in the pipeline. I would hear people say, well, we have to pay people too much to come here. Well, actually, research shows that black and brown people are paid less all over the world. Okay, they're paid less. And so, do you have any data? I would constantly go back. Do you have data for this? They'd also say things like, "Well, we brought in some, people of color in the past, and they left." And when they said that, they didn't take responsibility for, okay, well, what kind of environment did you create? Were you welcoming? Did you provide support? Did you provide mentoring? So you have to think about all those things. I think that people say they want diversity, but they don't actually act. And in the book, I use this really good example, which is not mine. It's from a researcher named Daryl Smith, who's really amazing. And she talks about how people say that they want to exercise or they say they want to lose weight, but they don't actually exercise. They talk about it, but they don't actually do the work to get them to, let's say, the body that they want to have. Of course, now with Ozempic and drugs like that, they probably don't need to do it. But I wrote this book before Ozempic. So basically, yeah, people have good intentions often, but they don't have a lot of follow through.
Professor, you named the elite trade-off between quality and diversity as an impediment. How should search committees redefine excellence so it is rigorous but not rooted in exclusionary assumptions?
So this is one thing that I kind of talked about a little bit already, but I'll say this is probably at the heart of this book is the idea that most of the people I talked to were just adamant that they needed to bring in a high quality group of faculty. And I agree. You know, you want top quality candidates, but over and over in their minds, when they heard the word quality, they immediately started thinking, well, if I'm going to recruit a diverse faculty, I'm going to have to be more concerned about quality. And again, I just think that that is a racist thing to say. Now, I don't think it's possible for an institution to be excellent unless it is diverse. Because when we bring in a whole variety of ideas, we are more excellent. Like when we have a variety of people working together, we're going to do better work. We're going to think of more innovative ideas. I don't know if that's happened to you, but that happens to me all the time. You know, I work on a really diverse team at my center, and I love it because I have people from different countries, different races, gender, sexuality, religion, language, all of that makes us it helps us to be stronger in what we do and more innovative. So, but you got to convince people of this because they kind of like to keep it the way that it's always been. And that's not excellent.
Professor, the power of pedigree appears as a recurring constraint. How does prestige signaling, like program advisor institution, narrow candidate pools? And what would a credible alternative evaluation process look like?
So again, another great question and something that really stood out to me is that most people were most comfortable when they're hiring if they are very familiar with the program from which the applicant comes from, if they know their advisor, and if they're comfortable with the level of prestige of the institution. So there are a lot of institutions that are not part of that AAU group, the Association of American Universities, that are really, really good institutions that produce high quality PhD students, but they don't happen to be part of this AAU organization. And many faculty don't want to hire anyone unless they're part of that institution, that organization. And so there's a lot of bias in terms of being very narrow. Now, here's another thing I found. Many of the institutions I talked with, the people there, they told me there were about 5 to 10, maybe 10 college or universities in the country that they were willing to hire from. And some people were only willing to hire from maybe four. Now, can you imagine narrowing who you're going to hire that much? I mean, that is just constraining who you can bring in and the greatness that you can bring in. So for me, an alternative, way to look at this is look at people's productivity, look at their actually read their work and see what the possibilities are and see who they are on their own without just assuming that they're going to be great because they had a great advisor. I believe 100% that my students are excellent, but you shouldn't just take my word for it. It shouldn't just be like, hey, I have great students, hire them. It should be, let's look at their CVs, let's look at their publications, let's look at their arguments, and let's hire people who have great innovative arguments, not who are just connected.
Professor, your research highlights rigidity in academic pipelines. Where do institutions lose doctoral talent of color most often, like in recruitment, mentoring, postdoc transition, shortlist, and which intervention has the highest leverage?
So, yeah, this is really interesting too. One of the things that I found is that a lot of people who serve in postdoc positions don't actually get hired by the institutions where they're a postdoc. In fact, they're likely to not get hired because they're looked upon as a postdoc. And that to me is really sad because you would think that they're getting used to the institution, they're getting all that experience. You would think that they would be one of the first people hired. Another thing that I found out, and again, just dismayed by this, is that a lot of the candidate pools were very diverse, and they were very diverse initially. Let's say, you start your search and you've got, I don't know, 300 people, incredibly diverse pool. Then they narrow it, and let's say they get to 150, incredibly diverse pool. Then they'll do another narrowing and they'll get to, let's say, 75, incredibly diverse pool. And then they do their final narrowing, and let's say it's 30, still really diverse, okay? But the people who get invited for interviews, they typically will be majority white. So you had this really diverse pool, and you went out there and did all this recruiting, but your short list ends up being majority white and often majority man. It depends on the field, but in a lot of fields, it can end up being like this. And, we were seeing a little movement on this, but in the United States, it's kind of gone back now because of the Trump administration and, their policies. So it to me, it was really baffling. You've got this incredibly diverse pool that you say that you want, but you don't pick anybody out of it. And then one thing I noticed is that if you go, let's say you bring in 4 candidates for a job, often I would ask, well, can you tell me about the 5th and the 6th candidates? Often those people were Black or brown, but they didn't make it into the top 4. If you really care about diversity, why aren't you looking at that 5th and 6th candidate? And can you tell me the difference between that 4th candidate and that 5th and 6th candidate? Usually there's not much of a difference, except for somebody on the committee knew their advisor, or somebody really likes their institution and it feels like we'll be more prestigious if we hire somebody from that institution.
Professor, you discuss failures of administrative leadership and lack of accountability. What should president or provost measure and publicly track if they want hiring practices to actually change beyond statements and task forces?
So I have a whole chapter in the book on leadership because leadership is absolutely essential. You have to have leaders who are going to speak out, and they really need to speak out in every meeting, in every situation that they possibly can. And when people do not take these hiring practices seriously, they have to hold them accountable by sometimes you got to close down a search. Sometimes you have to say, no, you know what? We are not hiring one more white man in this position when we have 26 in the department. Like it is really important that we diversify our department. Now, a lot of these things that I wrote about are all of a sudden controversial in the US, but should not be because we definitely do not have equity or parity in our faculty. And when I wrote about them, they wouldn't have been as controversial as they are now because we have some like just overt racism happening in our country. But it is really, really important that leaders stand up to that kind of racism and don't allow it to sort of, push over the progress that we've been making. And I do think that there has been some progress, but it's definitely not enough. And leaders need to kind of step in and hold faculty accountable. Here's another thing. If faculty tell you they can't find any diverse candidates, then ask them, for example, have you looked at the survey of earned doctorates that's published by the National Science Foundation? In that survey, it goes across all disciplines and it tells you where people are graduating. It tells you who's producing the most PhD candidates based on race and gender and a variety of other factors across disciplines. So are you using the data to make your decisions? That's something I would be asking. I think that's really important.
Dr. Marybeth, opacity and arbitrariness in recruitment and hiring is another barrier you identified. What are 2 to 3 steps that would make faculty searches more transparent without turning hiring into a checkbox exercise?
So one thing that I found out is that a lot of people do not review the job description before they post it or send it out. They just take the old one that they've been using for a long time. that might even have offensive kinds of language in it, and they keep using it. So one thing that you can do is make sure you have the most inclusive, welcoming, warm, empowering job description. That's really, really important. I think another thing that you want to do is you want to be thinking about hiring all the time. Even if you don't have a faculty search planned, you always want to be thinking about candidates and that you could hire. You can invite them in to give talks. You might want to think about go to conferences and talk to young faculty and PhD candidates, get their business cards, connect with them on like LinkedIn, and foster those relationships early so that when you have a search, then you can reach out to a broad audience and hopefully bring in some people who will really add to your innovation and your diversity.
Professor, a key argument is that leaders must acknowledge institutional failures of inclusion and biases that restrict faculty careers for people of color. What does acknowledgement look like in policy terms, like resources, authority, or consequences?
So for me, that means like, let's say you haven't been doing a good job, then just say it. Like, we haven't been doing a good job. Here are the things that we need to change. And this is why we're changing these things. And I think, it doesn't need to necessarily be a blame game, but it does need to acknowledge where the institution has not done a good job and then be very specific about what you're going to do. So make sure you have good policies, make sure you have enough resources to bring in. Maybe you should be bringing in 4 candidates rather than 3, because oftentimes when you bring in an extra candidate, that person ends up being a person of color. And maybe you should. Maybe you can put money toward what are called targets of opportunity, where you go after, people who are going to bring innovative and really fresh ideas. And many of those individuals may be women or people of color into your institution. I think that if you're a leader and you haven't been supporting these kinds of ideas, one of the best things you can do is stand up and say, I've failed in this regard, and I'm not going to do that anymore. I've read extensively, and I'm gonna move forward. So I think just kind of acknowledging and then moving forward is a good idea.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If a department chair listening to this podcast wants to do the right thing in the next search cycle, what is the first change you would insist on before the job and even goes live?
Okay, so department chairs, I think, they play a major role, and they can be, like, I would say they definitely need to be always looking for potential new colleagues. They need to be going to conferences, and I would go to graduate student paper sessions because you can meet young faculty and a lot of young faculty of color there. They need to also make sure, especially if they're at a major research institution, that their PhD candidates are highly diverse so that more of those individuals can get into major research institutions. I think they also need to make sure that they like put their foot down around what kind of department they want to be, and that they value diversity and that they value equity and inclusion, and that they stand behind that and are going to hold people to being accountable for caring about those kinds of issues within the department. Now, I will say, it shouldn't be controversial, but right now it is in the United States, and I hate that because I always tell people, how could you be against diversity? How could you be against equity? And how could you be against being inclusive? Those are all really wonderful things and beautiful things, beautiful ways of being. And we have to make sure that we don't let people convince us that they're not. So I think they just need to stand up.
Thank you, Professor Marybeth Gasman, for joining us and for challenging us to move beyond statements of intent towards systems that actually deliver equity in faculty hiring. Your work reminds us that the barriers are often embedded in everyday practices. How we define excellence, how we recruit, and how we evaluate, and how we hold ourselves accountable, and that meaningful change requires leadership, transparency, and follow through. To our listeners, whether you are a provost, dean, department chair, search committee member, or a doctoral student, we hope this conversation sparks not only reflection but action in your next hiring cycle. If you found today's episode valuable, please share it with your colleague, subscribe to the podcast, and leave us a review. It helps more people discover these critical conversations. Until next time, this is Deepak Bhatt, and you have been listening to Business Talk. Professor Gasman, thank you once again for your time and your continued commitment to justice in higher education. Thank you so much.
Thank you.